Well, hey everyone, welcome to Text Messages, a podcast at a First Christian Church of Huntington Beach. My name is Stephen Pates. I'm on staff here at the church. I'm one of the hosts of the podcast. I'm joined with Scott Martin, our lead pastor, the other host of the podcast. We also have Kurt Goebel, who is our producer, the man behind the camera. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now, Scott, here on this podcast, Text Messages, every week or whenever we do this podcast, we get together and we talk about the various messages that we find in the text of Scripture. It's kind of the whole thing. And so we're going to continue that today with a conversation on faith that's based on this new series we've been in.
Very cool. I'm excited about that. Yeah, we're a couple weeks into it when we're recording this. So it's been fun. It's been good. You and I sat down and talked about this a while ago. It's been good for me ever since then, and we've got good feedback. So I hope people have enjoyed the series. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the title of the series is Faith for Grownups, which is an incredible title. So great job coming up with that, or wherever you found that one.
I did steal it. There was another church that did one called The Bible for Grownups.
Okay.
So
you adapted it.
I put faith in. So I think if you change it 10%, it's yours or something.
I think so,
20%, so.
And I love that title because, it just gives this really good picture of what we've been talking about, the idea that faith is something that grows and evolves. And you said in one of your recent messages that, faith is never static. It's either growing or it's declining because it's relational. And that's been such a good reminder as we have been in this series together.
Yeah, and I think... I like the idea of faith for grownups too, because I think, for like you and I, and this isn't true for everybody, but you and I, we grew up in the church. And if you've been in the church any part of time, whether or not you grew up in it, I feel like sometimes you just get stuck in a place. Like whether it's things you think or things you believe or practices or whatever, and you just kind of get stuck in that moment. A lot of times where you first came to faith is what's most important to you. And so because it's like you and I, it's kind of gradual as you're growing up. A lot of times it's the style of your church. It may not be a moment, because when I look back on my church, it's like there's 20 years of my involvement before I became, an adult.
Right.
But for a lot of people, if you just come to church later on in life, you come when you're 20 or 30, it's that moment, it's that first church you go to where you experience faith and you decide hey, I want to be a part of this. That is so formative that we tend to hold on to that. We tend to want to come back to that. But it's no, sometimes, God is leading us new places and things change. And so we have to be willing to grow and move and hold on to what's beautiful and core and essential about faith. But then let God stretch us and change us as culture changes, as the world changes, as we change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great to be just on that journey so far. And what I want to do today as we have this conversation is we'll kind of lean into a few aspects of the series that we've touched on so far and then hopefully give just some ways to apply that for people that are listening and ways to continue to pursue faith in their lives and with us as a church. But I thought maybe we could begin by looking at something that you talked about, I think it was a couple weeks ago by the time we released this. It was called spiritual life mapping. And you led us through this exercise of really taking a look, kind of as you just said, at just your journey with Jesus, your journey with church and spirituality, and kind of figuring out some of those significant points. So could you kind of just share a little bit what that is? And then I would love to hear if you could kind of share a little bit about your own journey so far and kind of what has led you to where you are.
Yeah. We've done before as a staff, I don't know if you were here, we did a life mapping exercise. They're pretty common. It's common if you do, they're common in psychological settings. They're common if you're ever sitting down to do like a blue sky, dream about your future session, to go down. And it's just a way of reflecting on your past to kind of figure out where you are, to help you think about where you go forward. And so as we did this series, we wanted to do one that was focused specifically on our spirituality. And so we took, none of it really was necessarily original with us, but we just took from all these different life mapping exercises and kind of combined aspects and tweaked aspects to make it specifically about spiritual life mapping. And so the whole goal was to go through your life and to reflect on your life, but to reflect specifically in terms of where, and what we called them in the life mapping exercise, which you can still do, by the way, if you go to fccHB.com, there's a section that has to do with personal growth. You can still do it, and if you haven't done it, I would really recommend you do it. But we focused on the development of what we call core convictions, which some people might call beliefs. We just went with core convictions because we all have those. Right. Some of us would describe ourselves as people of faith, some of us wouldn't. Even within the Christian tradition, it's like you have people that talk about, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus. So we just went with those core convictions, those things that kind of guide your life, those foundational principles. And those all came from somewhere. And so the whole goal of the life mapping was to go back and the spiritual life mapping, to look at your life and see where your core convictions developed from. And so in my own life, because I did it first, the spiritual life mapping thing first, obviously, as I was developing, I wanted to figure it out. I've talked about this before, but I grew up in a Christian home, and I would say it was a strong Christian home. You know, by no means were we perfect, because I don't know that any family is perfect.
Right, yeah.
But my parents were not. I mean, they were great people. It wasn't like hypocritical. There wasn't like bad things. It was a strong Christian home, and my parents were really involved in the church. We were really involved in the church. I love the church. I don't really have bad experiences, like hurtful, painful experiences. I know some people do. And the church that I grew up in, I was actually thinking as we were preparing for this, I was trying to figure out how to define it. Because I grew up in like the 80s and 90s. I graduated high school in 1997. And so during that time, like you wouldn't describe the church I grew up in as traditional, because when I think of traditional, I think of robes and
like
things
more
like
liturgical.
that. Liturgical, yeah. And we weren't really liturgical, but if you look at the 80s when I grew up, we did sing pretty traditional music and things like that. So the best label I could come up with was like traditional contemporary.
Yeah.
There were elements of it that you could look at. I mean, we sang very traditional hymns and did things like that. But then when you got in the 90s, we did do more like contemporary worship songs. We were by no means like cutting edge. But it was kind of this traditional contemporary church. And it was in a city that throughout my childhood, our city changed drastically.
Right.
In a lot of ways. One of the ways it changed was just demographically. And you actually spent some time at that church.
It's
you
true.
worked at that church after I left, so you know that city now even probably better than I do. But it was a suburb of LA, and traditionally it was a white suburb, but it was becoming more and more Latino. Till the time that I graduated high school, I think almost 70% of my graduating class was Latino. And so it was a changing city demographically and all. So the church had to kind of navigate that, and we didn't do it horribly. We didn't do it all that great. It's hard. It's hard to figure that stuff out. I started working at the church when I was 18 years old. I went to Hope International University and got a bachelor's degree in church ministry from there in 2001. When I started working at the church, the lead pastor was a guy named Gordon Venturella, and he was a phenomenal pastor to work for. He was a very strategic guy. He had a heart for urban contexts. And did a lot in terms of like re-envisioning the city, and made a big impact, not just on the church, but on myself. He talked a lot about organizational structure, really to kind of modernize the organizational structure of the church. Talked a lot about culture, how we engage culture, the culture of the church. Linda and I got married, and we moved here to FCC in 2003. And that, I didn't expect that to be that big of a change, because Downey's only... I mean, if there's no traffic, it's like 20, 30 minutes. If there's traffic, it could be like an hour.
Right.
But it's not that far. But it is moving from LA County to Orange County. It's moving to a different church, and churches all have their own culture. And so it was a very different thing. Like when we got here, and I mean, some of it even just goes to the demographics of it. Like I remember Linda and I, we lived in a little condo down here when we first moved, and we went to the store, and that was the first time that I recognized, like I looked around, and I'm like, I feel weird, like I feel out of place, like because it was not, the area we lived was not very demographically diverse, and so everyone at the store was kind of white, and it was just weird. I remember, like Linda said at one point, she goes, "I feel like those weren't my people at the store," and so it was a change culturally, and also the church was very different. And whenever I say that, I always quote my friend Jeff Phillips, who he's from North America, but he's lived in Chile for 42 years, founded an organization that does work around the world. When he talks about cultures, he says it's not better or worse, it's just different. And so a lot of times we make the assumption that, well, my culture is better, but one of the things I've tried to maintain is, well, it's not. And so coming to the church here was a different culture. Not better or worse.
Yeah.
It was just different.
Oh.
And what I found is a lot of things that I had kind of grown up doing and thinking in regards to church, they just didn't fly here. Because it was different. Like the way I would have handled things at my home church in Downey, that didn't work here. And so it was, I don't want to say crisis, because that's a hard word for it, but it really caused a lot of evaluation, because all I had ever known was my home church, and I came here and I'm like, well, what worked there doesn't work here. What do I do? Like, how do I figure this out? And it got to the point where I think in some ways I put everything on the table, like about belief, like what is it that I really believe? At the same time, I was going to Pepperdine to finish up my master's degree. I did a master's degree in ministry from there. And so Linda and I kind of ended up doing it together because we were in the same boat. And so we didn't necessarily have a ton of support. People weren't like against us or anything, but we didn't have a ton of support. And so we were just kind of trying to figure out like, what do we really believe? Not just about church, but about faith and about Christianity, and what does it really mean to be a Christian? Because all I ever knew was my home church's brand of Christianity. And it's like, come here.
Wow.
I mean, we're still Christian. We still worship Jesus. We still pray. We still read the Bible, but it's different. And so what I ended up getting out of that long term, and it took a while, it was a process, is I appreciated my past and I appreciated my upbringing, but I knew that faith had to be bigger than that. Like my faith had to be bigger. Like I didn't have a faith that accounted for everything and all the gray in life. It was very kind of black and white,
right?
And so it needed to be bigger. And then as I've been here for 18 years, you go through things like Linda and I had 2 kids and ultimately made the transition to become the lead pastor. And then even this last year, you go through the pandemic. And so you go through all these experiences in life, and those all form you and those all challenge you and they make you rethink, hey, what are your priorities and what do you really think and what's most important? So you go through all that. And what I found myself now, like looking back on it, is over the last kind of 18 years, and please hear me out on this, don't think I've lost it, is in a lot of ways, I found myself less and less, like increasingly not identifying with a lot of what's considered like historical American Christianity. And I don't mean that in terms of like Jesus, or I don't think church is important, but just as the culture shifted, as I went through all these things personally, as we went through all these things as a nation, as a culture, there just seemed to be this widening gap between Christianity and between popular culture, and I think both sides kind of pushed away from each other. And so while I didn't fully, I never fully identified with, hey, the American dream, American culture, whatever you want to call it, I kind of grew up always identifying with the Christian side, but I just found myself less and less identifying. And I was just thinking, like, there's got to be another way. It's not this either or thing. Because when you look at the Apostle Paul, I mean, he's a guy that brilliantly navigates being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus in a Roman world that is like polar opposite.
Right.
And he does it without being enemies. He's got his lines he won't cross. And he just seemed to navigate it to me so much better than I felt like we as an American church were doing. And so that was a point where I really went back, and this is why I've talked a lot about it lately, but I went back into the early church and even back into the Stone Campbell movement, which I talk about how we're a part of.
Right.
Our church, which is this unity movement that goes back to, I think the 1860s is when it starts in Kentucky, and it's Stone and Campbell are these 2 Presbyterian ministers who come together and they try to drop all the denominational titles, and it's a unity movement. And, their big slogan is, we're not the only Christians, we're Christians only.
Yeah.
And I really, that kind of came out of my past, because my home church in the Downey Church was very much Stone Campbell.
Right.
We had some staunch, Stone Campbell people there. And so it was cool to go back and to recover that and to see, hey, this is this part of me that's ingrained in my DNA. And what does that look like now? Because I don't know that emphasis has always been an emphasis for me, but it's always been in there. And so that's where things like life mapping have been helpful to me, as I navigated all this and tried to figure out, where do I go and who am I becoming and what's happening, to find these things from my past that, hey, some of them are things that I've let go, but there's some great things there that I've been able to hold on to that are core convictions in my life that I think are kind of helping me navigate, and even helping us as a church, because we're a Stone Campbell church here too, navigate as we go into the future. And it's this desire to, let's not focus on the things of Christianity. Let's focus on Christ, and let's strip all that other stuff away and bring faith back to the core of what it's about. It's about engaging Jesus. And that's been a process for me. And I'm 42, and it's taken me 42 years to get there. But that's
right.
I don't know. What about you? As you look back kind of on your journey and all that stuff. Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so my story is similar to yours in the fact that I grew up in the church as well. And, both my mom's side of the family, my dad's side of the family were kind of steeped in church tradition. Like my dad's side of the family, they were Presbyterians. And my mom, she kind of came from more of the non-denominational camp. She had been a part of a Restoration Christian, movement church, Stone Campbell movement church. So they kind of came together, and from the time I was little, I remember being like just in church. I actually grew up going to a church that no longer exists called the First Christian Church of Santa Ana. So that was like a Christian Restoration Movement church in Santa Ana, and I don't know what happened, it went away, but like that's kind of where I started in preschool, and my mom worked there. So kind of my whole life, I was part of church, came to faith at a really young age, was baptized when I was like 9 years old. So just kind of did the whole children's ministry thing. You talked a little bit about like, just being a part of a church in the 80s, the 90s. So for me, it was more like 90s, early 2000s. That was like youth group for me. So it was like all of like the Christian subculture. I was like so into that, all the Christian concerts.
Was like purity culture a big thing then?
It was.
All that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Christian concerts, that was huge.
Christian concerts, youth rallies, what we call them.
Who was your favorite Christian band? Give me a good one.
Yeah. I mean, DC Talk was one. If you ever heard of DC Talk, they're pretty great. Switchfoot, they branched out a little bit, but that was a big one. Reliant K as well.
Oh, I loved Reliant K. I still listen to Reliant K sometimes.
Yeah, they're great. They're great. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many, but, that was like a big part of it. And, I look back on that, and there were some challenges for sure and some things that weren't perfect, but a big part of kind of my, I think, faith formation, those early years were a part of a community. And that's a core conviction for me, because when I look at when my faith began to really take root in my life, it was when I was in high school. And I had gone to a private school from 1st to 8th grade. So I actually went to a Catholic school. And so I always kind of joke that I was like, if Martin Luther was around, I would have said, like, eat your heart out, I towed the line. Like I was doing the Catholic thing and then the non-denominational thing. But, I wasn't a practicing Catholic, but I just went to that school. And so I kind of grew up with a very rich, I think, understanding of different traditions within Christianity. But in high school, I went to a public high school, and it was the community of people that I had around me. It was my friends that really helped my faith grow. And I remember like even being this freshman and kind of just really nervous going to high school, and there were seniors in the youth group that like looked out for us, that were like big brothers, big sisters. And so there really was this sense of like, we're in it together. And that was so huge for me. And so from that experience, just being a part of that community, I felt like I wanted to pursue that in my life. And there's this thing called calling, right? When we think about if we're going to pursue vocational ministry, feeling like, this is what you want to give your life to. And usually, that's something that God puts on your heart. And usually other people kind of affirm that and say, hey, I think this would be a good fit for you. Or you have giftings or gifts that you might use for that. So I remember from that, just not knowing what that meant at all, but pursuing, going to a Christian college and kind of going to that experience. And from there, then, eventually starting at a church and working there. And I look back and, there's so many ways I think we can understand like our Christian story and like conversion. And I often think of like the Apostle Paul in the New Testament and then Peter. And they have very different stories of how they kind of found faith, and where Paul has this very dramatic conversion moment when he's, on the road to Damascus, and then Jesus, he has this vision, he sees him and he's like, oh, and all sorts of crazy things happen, he's blind, he can't see, and then he's like, all right, I'm following Jesus now, I'm being this huge leader for the church. And it's almost like this immediate conversion. Now, people might argue that he had a lot of things that brought him to that place, with his training, but it was kind of this immediate thing. And then, Peter is someone that like, he follows Jesus like early on in his ministry, but he has these moments where he's like, he gets it, then he doesn't. He ends up denying Jesus. So he kind of is like back and forth. It's almost like he has a long conversion. And I've almost related more to Peter in my life, where there's been moments where I'm like, I get it, moments when I haven't, moments when I'm working things out, just in my own struggles in life. But the kind of the thing that has kept it together is just Jesus continually like calling me forward. And so I just go back to, that community, what it means to grow in community, what it means to be discipled. And when people kind of were able to come around me and just speak into my life and realize that in a lot of ways, my Christian journey, I think about it in a personal way, like my faith, my journey, but really it was being part of the church and learning that. And so that kind of led me to work at a few different churches. And so I was at, we talked about the church in Downey, 91st Christian Church. I was there for a number of years, but had a chance to work at a couple other churches. And it's so interesting when you talk about going from the church you've known to like a new one. well, things are different, right? And you're kind of learning that about like the culture, the leadership structure, the style of ministry. And that's been really a great experience for me to have these different ministry contexts, because it's like I'm able to kind of see, well, that was different there, but that was great. And then there were these things here that maybe were a little new or uncomfortable, but I learned from them. Mm-hmm. And just this reminder of how big like the church is, the universal church is, and how there's this connection regardless of where you are and what that specific context looks like. So I don't know, some of those things just have stayed with me as I've continued just to follow Jesus and try to follow his way of life and learning just like, okay, God, there's still stuff you're working through me and leading me forward. But definitely faith is a journey, right? And I think that is the biggest thing. And what's so neat is that our journeys are different. They look different, and yet we're pursuing that the same goal of trying to be like Jesus. So that kind of has led me here. And so I heard you say this a little bit, just kind of in your own story. But obviously, there are things that we might feel hinder us. There are obstacles that we overcome, and you shared a little bit about those. But I kind of want to lead that into one of the subtopics almost in this series, which is this word deconstruction. Mm-hmm. It sounded like you went through that a little bit. You were describing, coming here and when you were doing your master's degree and figuring out what that is. So I shared a little bit about that in my message as we open up the series. But for you, like, how do you understand deconstruction? Like, kind of what would you say is deconstruction? And then let's just like lean into that a little bit as we kind of define it, and then kind of talk about why it's a common thing and why it's a good thing too.
Yeah. I think I was first introduced to the idea of deconstruction a few years ago with like YouTube videos. Like someone had told me about it, or I heard about it. It's like you could go on YouTube and you could see videos of people sharing their deconstruction stories. And typically those stories were essentially why someone walked away from faith.
Right.
And a lot of times it tended to be younger, whether it was like teenagers or young 20s, kind of explaining like, hey, I grew up in the church and I went through this and I walked away. And the stories were interesting to me because you could tell, like, most of the stories that I saw, it wasn't like bitterness. Like, these weren't necessarily people who, and even when they would describe their deconstruction stories, there was like pain to it. Because there was, even if they typically they walked away from the church because of different beliefs.
Right.
Like, I believe differently. But there was some pain of, yeah, but I lost this community, or there was this good thing. And so they were interested in me. And I sat to like, and I'm not going to say I listened to hours of them, but I listened to a bunch of them. And even now there's a couple podcasts I listen to that are based around, and I don't listen to them every week or anything, but they're kind of based around people sharing deconstruction because I want to hear that. Like, I'm just curious, like.
Right.
And I think it was a few years later that I believe it was Andy Stanley. I heard him say one time that deconstruction stories broke his heart because most of the reasons people walked away from Christianity had nothing to do with actual Christianity. Like, at its core, it had to do with some attitude the church had taken, or some stance the church had taken that wasn't necessarily like
or some relational thing.
Yeah, some relational. Yeah. And I mean, some people have experienced, like, some of these you listen to and it's heartbreaking. Like, people said, I sat with the pastor, the leaders of the church, and they said this, and I just, like, there was one time I listened to most of my podcasts when I run a little bit in the morning and I walk my dogs. I just literally stopped. This person was talking, they were like, this is what the pastor said, and I just I was angry, I was sad, I was like, I can't believe someone would say that. And so it's like all these different heartbreaking stories. But deconstruction, it's kind of a difficult thing to talk about because it's so personal. Because when someone says, like, I'm going through deconstruction, I'm experiencing deconstruction, it's kind of unique to each and every person. It's kind of like saying family. When you say the word family, it's like a loaded word. Like, it might mean one thing to you, it might mean something else to me, it might mean something else to Kurt. And so I always try to be careful of too strictly defining deconstruction. But I mean, when you look at like the dictionary definition of it, I mean, it's about taking something apart. You're taking something apart that is theoretically important to you, or at least at one point was important to you. But then there's other people that point out, but it does contain the word construction. So there's also an aspect of you're putting something together. Right. And the interesting thing about deconstruction is deconstruction, some people talk about it as if it's a destination, but I've always understood it more as a process. It's a process that you go through that when you talk about faith, which is usually where we use the term deconstruction, you're deconstructing the faith that you came from or that you grew up with, and you're going to build something else that could be very similar to that, and it could be very different.
Right.
Like deconstruction doesn't have an end goal. It's just this process of I'm going to kind of, again, take apart. I'm going to take apart this system, this structure, and then I'm going to build something else that may be way simpler, but you never know what it's going to be. So it's that process of, like I said, kind of taking it apart. Mm. And when I look back on my life, I don't think there was ever a moment when I was in deconstruction. I didn't hear of it as a word, like I said, until a few years ago. Mm-hmm. But we didn't use it, 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
And so there was no phrase there wasn't where I was like, oh yeah, I'm deconstructing. But I do think there was one major time in my life when I did it. And I do think there's been and continues to be minor times in my life. Mm-hmm. The big time is when Linda and I came out here. And it wasn't just the transition out here. There was a whole bunch of other things that happened at that particular period of time. I've talked about it before, but we struggled for a few years with like infertility, and that was a hard thing. And so there was other like personal things that were going on in there. And so during that time, it was this, again, I talked earlier about how like I knew faith had to be bigger. Like it just, what I had grown up with wasn't working. And so I had to do something else. And it was hard. And that's why I think that's why I listened to deconstruction stories, because I know Christians on a whole weren't really helpful for me at that point in my life.
Yeah.
And it's not because they weren't sincere, they didn't care. I just think when people start to share that they're struggling or they're doubting, we get afraid. Like we look at the culture around us and we realize, hey, we're becoming more and more post-Christian. Christianity matters less. So if a friend comes up to you and says, man, I'm really struggling with whatever, the Bible. I'm really struggling with what the Bible. Is it really the Word of God? We start to panic, and it's like, oh, you're backsliding. You're going the other way. You're doing this. And so we try to say things like, just pray about it. Just read the Bible. It's like, yeah, but that's not helpful, and that just makes things worse.
Right.
And so it was a tough experience, and it was a lonely experience. I never walked away from what were like the core tenets of faith. Mm-hmm. But I definitely took things apart that I found in my life to be obstacles for me and for other people. Because there were some things in my life about the way I thought about things that I think were an obstacle to me connecting with Jesus. Like I grew up being told that like you just pray. And I don't know that anyone told me this straight out, but this was like the kind of spirituality I grew up with. Pray and read the Bible for a half hour a day.
It was like modeled that was.
Yeah, like that. And that's just like, that's just what you do. You pray. But no one ever told you like, here's how to pray, here's how to read the Bible. And so that was like hard for me. And I just didn't like sitting down and reading. And then like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to pray for. Like it was hard. And so like, as I learned like, oh, there's like 1,000 different ways to pray. And you can just literally pray by repeating the same word over and over again for 10 minutes. And for some people that might be routine. Yeah. But for other people, that's like incredibly life-giving. And so it was like trying to figure out like, what does it really mean to connect with Jesus? What does it really mean to pray? Right. How do you really read the Bible? And those were obstacles for me. But I also saw within Christianity things that were obstacles for other people. You know, in the book of Acts, when they're trying to figure out what to do with Jews and Gentiles, and they decide, no, this is for everybody. That's one of the things that's in Acts 15 that comes out of that conference is they say, we should not make it difficult for people who are trying to come to Jesus. Yeah. And so I found within Christianity there was obstacles that people had that were non-essential things. And so how do we remove those? So what about you? I mean, is that how you understand deconstruction, and have you experienced a time or times of deconstruction in your life?
Yeah, so I can see like two periods in my life that I might classify as deconstruction of that process of breaking down faith and then rebuilding it. And the first one happened when I was sort of in college, kind of towards the end of college, when I was just starting in ministry. And a lot of it was just pushing back on some of the things that I thought ministry was, just from my own experience. And in those early years, I did a lot of just comparing kind of, myself and the church I was at to other ministries and thinking this is what it looks like to be successful. And so a lot of that was just kind of stripping it down, like what really am I trying to do? What really is church? And I did a lot of that in the context of youth ministry, because I did youth ministry for a number of years. I know you did as well. And youth ministry, if you're kind of from outside the church, youth ministry is like a weird thing to describe really, but because it's kind of this subculture within Christianity and the church. But working with young people was always just a ton of fun. And and life-giving. And I found just even in creating a space, creating ministry, that there were so many things that was just kind of pushing back. Like, what does it really look like to be the church now for young people? And we definitely had a lot of fun and did a lot of great youth group type things, but also just kind of trying to get to the core of like following Jesus in a very rapidly changing culture, and how to really support people and create space for conversations. And so I think that was the first time that I just kind of pushed back, and there were some great authors that kind of helped come alongside me in that point. We have mentors in our life, which are fantastic to have those people, but you also can find those in people you've never known. As you read their words, as you kind of just like let them sort of mentor you from afar, and you have like these old dead friends who are still speaking like through their books. And so there are a number of people that helped with that. Someone I talk a lot about, and we've talked about Henry Nouwen, just his way of understanding the spiritual life, and that was just so different because it was less like business-like, less corporate, more just real relationship with Jesus and other people. And I think that helped me get away from the program mindset to like, no, actually, can I just be with someone and not have an agenda per se of like, well, how does this fit into my I'm going to use this phrase because this was really popular, the purpose-driven kind of mindset and model, which was just sort of, what are you doing? What are you trying to take it? Not that that was bad or anything, but I think that sometimes that could become like the goal instead of just really trying to love someone and be with them. So I think that was the first time I really started thinking through like, okay, what is the gospel really about? And how can the church be something that's less just program driven and more about people and more about, we're in this community together. So that one happened, and then I had another episode of deconstruction that happened later, and I'd been in ministry a while, for several years, but I just went through a really difficult time, and I went through, there's a lot of things happening. I had lost my aunt; she had passed away from cancer, and so I was mourning that. I went through like burnout, and if you've ever had burnout before, just in life in general, where you're working, you're burning the candle at both ends. I mean, it can feel really isolating. You feel really alone, and so there was a lot that was going in there. There was some stuff just in my own life that I think I hadn't dealt with, and all of that was kind of coming to the surface. And I went through kind of a major process of like, what am I doing? Like, what do I believe? And it was difficult. Like, it was really like kind of more of a painful thing. And it wasn't necessarily me doubting God or doubting God's goodness, because when I look back on my life, I realized that, God had always been with me and always had people there for me. But it was just sort of this looking at everything and then just trying to say, well, what do I believe, and what are some of these things that are coming up for me? And that kind of let me enter into this period of reflection, of working things out, of having honest conversations, of being vulnerable, which I think sometimes is hard to do for all of us. But I think especially sometimes when you're in a leadership position, you struggle with being vulnerable because you're afraid of being judged, or you're afraid of what people might think. And so actually going into that space was part of deconstruction, and really part of like, I'm struggling with this belief, I'm mourning, I'm honestly dealing with just burnout. And in that process, there were a lot of really good things that happened. I did counseling. I had some people that I might label as like a spiritual director, which just basically means like a mentor that was just kind of guiding and offering prayer and support and things like that. And that really kind of helped me, again, kind of rebuild some of those things, and really after that time, just feeling like I was so enamored by Jesus, like who he was, what his vision for life was, that he came to give me the fullness of life, and he wanted me in that relationship. And that really began kind of more of like, that's that foundation. Like, I want to bet everything on Jesus, like on who he is. Like, I could be wrong about a lot of things in my life. I probably am wrong about a lot of things. I know I am. But he's the most fascinating person that ever lived. And I want my life to reflect his. I want to pursue him. And that kind of started to be that turning point for me.
Yeah, and I think that's the really important thing in deconstruction, is identifying what's the trigger that put you there.
Yeah.
Because, I'm not going to say there aren't people who just wake up one day and think, I'm going to tear it all down, like, just for fun. Like, I'm not going to say that doesn't happen, but a majority of the time, and usually it's not one thing. Usually it's like a list of things that lead up to it, but there's something that kind of pushes you over. And so what is it that led you to that point? And a lot of like what you said is themes. I see it themes in my life, see it in themes of other people's lives. Things like burnout, things like exhaustion, whether it's physical exhaustion or emotional exhaustion. Like we said, sometimes it's bad experiences in the church.
Yeah.
That the leadership of the church, they just hurt you, or someone within the church hurt you. And so I think when you find yourself in that period where you're like, you are deconstructing or you're a part of taking that down, you have to be very conscious. You have to be able to like name and label what's the trigger that got me here. Because what I always want to be careful to do is what makes faith so complicated is we put everything back on God. Like it's always ultimately God's fault.
Right.
And what I've learned in my life is like that's not always true. Like it's like one of the biggest I look back and this was as we were preparing for this, I look back, one of the biggest obstacles in my own faith journey is myself.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, absolutely.
I'm stubborn. I can be hard-hearted sometimes. I can be very critical. And so like I've been like there's a lot of things I've had to overcome that are just things about me.
Yeah.
Whether it's natural, these are qualities that I was born with, or these are qualities that I learned, or I picked them up somewhere along the way. It's like I've had to overcome myself and have had to be patient with myself and allow God to transform me. And the same thing is true for other people. And sometimes you go into churches, and churches all have systems and they have structures. And sometimes those systems and structures are jacked up.
Yeah.
And they're jacked up for a lot of different reasons. And so you want to be able to name that and identify that. And so as you're going through your deconstruction, you're really conscious of what is it that I'm really pushing back against? What is it? Is this something that's core, like you said, is this something that's core to the person of Jesus? Because there are people that have issues with Jesus, something Jesus did, something Jesus said. But I've always tried to make sure, like, is this something with Jesus? Is this something with the Bible? Is this something with church in general? Is this something with this church? Is this something with leadership? Is this something with this leadership? Because for me, that's been kind of important to me. It's distinct. Instead of just throwing it all and saying, well, God sucks because I had a bad experience at this church, I had a bad experience there. Like, I get that we had a bad experience, but I also want to deal with that bad experience. And to do that, I have to name it and I have to get specific about it. A lot of times when bad things happen or we walk away, and not everyone who goes through deconstruction is bitter. Hear me out on this.
Right.
Not everyone who does is bitter, but a lot of people are. And one of the questions people ask me sometimes is about house churches, because you'll find a lot of people like, I'm going to leave the institutional church, I'm going to go start a house church. Most of the house churches that I'm familiar with are like, they just don't work. And the reason they don't work is because they're started out of bitterness and cynicism. Because people are bitter and cynical, and they blamed it on the church. And so they're like, well, I'm going to do my own thing. But they took their bitterness and their cynicism with them, and anything born out of bitterness and cynicism is just bad. And so, you're angry at the church, but you didn't really deal with why you were angry, and you didn't really deal with what hurt you. Maybe it was this specific church. Maybe it was this person. Maybe it was this thing that's fundamentally wrong with this particular branch of Christianity or whatever. But I've always wanted to be able to distinguish that, not just to like, so we don't blame God for everything, but I think it's important to deal with it. I think you have to name something in order to deal with it.
Yeah. No, I think that's so helpful to figure out what the object is of that, what the specifics are, because that helps the process, right? You're not just in kind of this vague, like ephemeral, like it's all over the place, but really like leaning into what am I pushing back against here, and what is it? And I think that's such a helpful thing. And there's just this quote that was something that kind of came up for me as we're talking, and part of my deconstruction story, I guess, so the second time that I think was thinking through things, is really, I think about the object of faith being Jesus. And one of the things that I had realized in my life that had often happened was part of my faith and part of being Christianity was I was oftentimes looking for like something, like I really want to feel like a certain way. So I was doing something for like security, like if I do this or, believe this, and kind of expecting God to maybe handle all those things, instead of from a place from that as a foundation, like from a place of security where identity really was in Jesus. It wasn't in performance. It wasn't in, all these different things. And having kind of the freedom to not hold God accountable for all the bad things that happen in life, that he isn't causing these things. I know there's different ways that we understand God's sovereignty and how he works in our lives, but realizing that, when bad things happen, which sometimes is the cause of deconstruction, not always, that seeing how God is walking with us through that and going through that process, going through lament, going through grieving things. And I think changing that perspective, really kind of diving into it is a helpful thing.
Because it's helped me. I mean, I look back on my own preaching over the last couple of years. I'll talk a lot about Constantinian shift, like when Constantine becomes emperor. I'll mention the Enlightenment quite frequently. And the reason I mention these things is because what I had to learn is a lot of these things that I was pushing back against, a lot of these things that through my own deconstruction story was going through, they weren't native to the early church. They weren't native to the gospel. They're things that happened as a result of some of these monumental shifts throughout history. Yeah. That because of Constantine converting the empire, because of the Enlightenment, because of just the Western world that we live, all these things have been incorporated, and we see them as no, this is what the church is. But when you pull it back, it's yeah, but it's not. This came from somewhere, and it's not necessarily evil where it came from, but it's not core, it's not foundational, it's not essential. You don't see this in early churches. And then there's a lot of things that we do that early church are, it's never going to be the same. Like a church in different context, culture is never going to be the same. But that was helpful to me because it allowed me to see what is it that I really struggle with, and then where did this thing even come from? Is this thing even core or essential to faith, or is this something we can look at and go, hey, this is why we do that, but we actually don't need to do that because that's not really that important. And in fact, while it may have been helpful 1,500 years ago, it's harmful now. So let's get rid of it. So
yeah. I love that, and that's another great thing to keep in mind as we process, faith and what it looks like in our context. Well, we covered some great things, but let's just, as we kind of head towards the end of this episode, get practical about a few things that people might do if they are looking to grow in their faith. Also, if they're going through deconstruction, which maybe people who are listening right now, they've gone through that recently, or maybe they are in that process, or they're maybe at least in a process of questioning faith, and they wouldn't label it as deconstruction. But what are some practical things that we can kind of do as a church, as individuals, to keep moving forward with God and to keep faith growing and evolving?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is if you are at a place where you find yourself, whether or not you would use it as describing the word deconstruction or not, but if you're at a place where you begin to question things, that's okay. Don't be angry at yourself. Don't think, oh, my faith is weak. No, you're human. You're going to do that. I do that all the time. I'm going to do that for the rest of my life, I hope. Right. That's part of how we grow. And so don't be afraid of that. And I would also say to people, if someone, a friend of yours, a family member, a child in specific, comes up to you and begins to question, I don't know what I think, don't respond in fear. Don't. I've always, if God really is God, I don't have anything to be afraid of. Right. And so it really, your fear has to do with your lack of confidence in God, I think. And so don't be afraid and don't be critical and don't just try to give them cheesy answers. Sit down and listen and just ask them, well, tell me about that. What's that like? And just use questions like that. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? And it's okay to not have the answers, and you just be supportive and be there. And if they want to talk. Don't be too quick to give advice. Yeah. But just listen and help people process. Ultimately, the greatest counselors in the world, the greatest mentors in the world, they don't ever tell you what to do. Because most of us know what we want to do. Right. We just have to be able to process and get there. So if you can listen, if you can develop good listening skills, that's incredibly helpful to other people. I would also say to those of us who go through any kind of deconstruction, any kind of faith, faith questioning, is to remember, and I said this last week, spiritual formation's not a one-size-fits-all. Right. So you're going to listen to someone, whether you're having a personal conversation or you go to church and listen to someone at church, or you read a book or listen to a podcast, and they're going to tell you what works for them. And most people take what works for them and teach it as this is what you have to do. Right. This is what I do and this is what happens. But we're all so different, and spirituality is a customizable thing. And so you have to figure out what works for you and what works for your rhythms. And so I would encourage you to start where your heart is. And we all have things that we're drawn to. Some of us are drawn to reading. Some of us are drawn to journaling. Some of us are drawn to to doing things like serving, social justice. Like, start with where your heart is and begin to engage in that. Start there. Because just about anything, if it's done in a way to honor God or seek God, can be spiritual. And so start where your heart is. But also I would say this, don't avoid the things that are difficult. Because it's really easy to be like, oh, well, I'm all about this, so I'm just not going to do this. Because what I can tell you from my own experience is that the biggest breakthrough in your life is probably going to come from the thing that's most difficult.
Yeah.
You're going to easily be drawn to, hey, if you like to read, then you know what, sitting down and reading a psalm is just, you love poetry and you're going to journal about it, and that's great. You don't want to get out there and serve. Well, start where your heart is. But then at some point, you're gonna have to engage those things that are more difficult, and that's probably where you're going to grow the most. And also, don't be afraid. Like I said, because it's not a one-size-fits-all program, if you listen to someone, if you read someone, if you listen to a podcast, don't be afraid to like take from them what's helpful and then kind of get rid of the rest. Like I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I don't remember who it was, but they were describing a spiritual routine that they did in their life. And like the first half of it, I was like, that's brilliant. I was just like completely blown away. And then they described like the second half of it, and I was like, that is the dumbest thing ever. Like you just took what to me sounds like the most brilliant spiritual practice ever, and you just flush it down the toilet. And so I was like, you know what? No, I'm gonna take that first part, and I actually in my mind like created, and this is what I would do next. So take what works, and then don't be afraid to like throw away the rest and make it work for you. So.
I love that.
Do you have anything?
I mean, I don't have anything to add to that. I think that's fantastic. Start with your heart, right? As you said, don't be afraid to do something that's difficult, and then don't be afraid to take the things that work and then leave the things that don't. I think that's a great kind of way to wrap things up, and whatever that looks like when it comes to engaging faith, and finding resources, being involved in church. I think we can take those three things and really apply them. And also, as you kind of mentioned earlier, we do have a new page on our website, fcchb.com/personal growth, and we have just some resources on there to continue the faith journey.
And we're going to be adding to those. I'm not 100% sure when this one will air, but we'll be adding to those in the next couple of weeks, but we'll probably continue to add to those in the future. So I would encourage you to check that out from time to time and just see what's there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott, thanks so much for sharing and being able to share a little bit about your faith story, and thank you for this series and kind of guiding us through this. And I'm excited for us to continue this conversation.
Yeah, hey, thank you, man. Thank you for sharing. And you've done half the series, so thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, hey, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time on Text Messages.